I sat on the terrace, wrapped in a soft blanket, feeling the cool evening air on my face. The sun was slowly sinking below the horizon, leaving a golden trail across the surface of the lake. Next to me was a cup of green tea, still slightly steaming, and the scent of jasmine filled the air. Andrew had recently moved in with me after his parents' difficult divorce. At 18, he looked much older. There was a sadness and weariness in his eyes, as if he had seen too much for his age. I hadn't seen him look so thoughtful in a long time. Today, he seemed particularly quiet, and I sensed that he needed space to process everything that had happened to him. "Evelyn," he called softly as he stepped out onto the terrace. I looked up to see him standing in the doorway, shifting uneasily from foot to foot. "Is there something I can help you with?" I smiled, sensing that there was more to his offer than just politeness. "Of course you can. How about helping me with the garden? The roses need some extra tending. They've been particularly fussy this year." Andrew smiled, and I saw a glimmer of interest in his eyes. We grabbed the tools and headed out into the garden. As we worked together, I began to remember the summer holidays he had spent with us as a child. Little Andrew, running around the garden in shorts with dirty hands, smiled at me with each memory. "Remember when you fell in the pond trying to catch a frog?" I laughed, reminding him of those funny moments that once seemed so important. "How could I forget? You jumped in to save me, only to fall into the water immediately afterwards." He smiled, and the same boyish joy flickered in his eyes again. We laughed together, and I felt a warm, almost familial bond form between us. The evening gently embraced us with its coolness, and I realized that this moment had become an oasis in the storm of emotions we had both been through in recent months. When the garden was in order, we returned to the terrace to enjoy the silence and the sunset. Just as I thought the day had come to an end, I noticed that Andrew was watching me intently. There was something new and inexplicable in his gaze, as if he was trying to understand something important. I felt a slight nervousness, but decided not to dwell on it. Suddenly, Andrew came closer. "You know," he began quietly, "I've always known that you weren't like everyone else. You've always understood me better than anyone." I froze for a moment, feeling a warm sensation rise inside me. "Andrew, I've always loved you, you know that," I said gently. His gaze never left mine. At some point, I saw his eyes deepen, as if he had made an inner decision. But instead of continuing the conversation, he suddenly leaned in and lightly touched my lips with his. It was quick, almost fleeting, but I felt my heart suddenly stop. I pulled away, embarrassed and surprised, and felt a wave of warmth wash over my face. An awkward silence hung in the air, but I didn't want to spoil the moment. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice full of regret and confusion. I don't know why I did that." I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. "It's okay," I finally said, my thoughts swirling like autumn leaves in the wind. "Just let's forget about it, shall we?" He nodded, but his gaze remained alert, almost studying. I tried to smile, but inside, I felt something unexplainable slowly working its way into my heart. The next day, I woke early, hoping to distract myself from the thoughts of the previous evening. I heard the clatter of dishes in the kitchen and immediately realized that Andrew was already up. I wanted to avoid him to give myself some time to think, but it was hard to hide in a small house. I gathered my courage and walked into the kitchen, trying to appear calm. Andrew was at the stove, frying eggs. He looked focused, but I noticed he glanced at me briefly, his face reflecting something between nervousness and anticipation. "Good morning," he said, too cheerfully, as if trying to relieve some tension. "Good morning," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Breakfast for both of us, of course," he smiled, but there was a barely perceptible shadow in his smile. We ate breakfast almost in silence, and I could feel an uncomfortable tension between us. I knew I couldn't ignore what had happened, but I wasn't ready to bring it up. Finally, I decided that we needed to do something to ease the tension a little. "Andrew," I said, trying to put as much confidence in my voice as I could, would you help me with the old shed? There's something that needs fixing and I can't manage it alone." "Sure, why not?" he replied, obviously glad of the opportunity to distract himself. We walked to the old shed where garden tools and wooden crates were stored. I switched on the light, and the dim bulbs illuminated the dusty room with a soft yellow glow. We started sorting tools, moving boxes, and discussing what to keep and what to throw away. With every minute I spent in that cramped room, I felt the tension between us grow. His presence seemed too close, too tangible. I buried myself in a shelf, trying to concentrate on what I was doing, when I suddenly felt his gaze on me. "You can't just pretend like nothing happened," he said quietly, his voice a mixture of embarrassment and determination. I froze, feeling my heart begin to beat faster. "Andrew, I'm not sure we should be discussing this," I replied, trying to sound calm, but inside a storm was raging. He took a step closer, his voice rising. "No, we have to, because I feel something important has happened, and you know it too." I turned away, not knowing what to say. His words were direct, but at the same time there was something in them that touched me. At that moment, I felt his hand touch mine. I turned sharply to face him and saw his eyes, deep and filled with emotions he couldn't hide. "Andrew, don't," I whispered, but he moved closer. I could feel his breath on my skin, and at that moment everything around us seemed to disappear. Suddenly and abruptly, as if it was out of his control, he kissed me again. This kiss was very different, more insistent, with a hint of desperate need for a response. For a moment I stood still, but then I stepped back, feeling my head spin. "No, this is wrong," I said, pulling away but unable to take my eyes off him. I didn't know what to do or how to react. Everything seemed too confusing and dangerous. Andrew immediately backed away, his face flushed with embarrassment. "I'm sorry. I just don't know what's happening." His voice trembled, and I realized that he really didn't know what to do. I took a deep breath and tried to find the right words. "Andrew, we have to set boundaries. What's happening could hurt both of us," I said quietly, trying to calm him and myself. He nodded, but his eyes told me he didn't agree. "Just let me work this out," he muttered, and I sensed that this conversation would continue, building like a wave ready to crash on the shore. We returned to the house in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. But I knew one thing. This story was just beginning, and it would continue to unfold, leaving neither of us unchanged. In the days that followed, I tried to act as if nothing had happened. I went about my day, planning meetings with friends, doing the housework and tending the garden. But every time I saw Andrew, his presence caused a sense of unease in me that became increasingly difficult to ignore. I also noticed that he tried to avoid conversation and even eye contact. This made living under the same roof feel strange and tense. So I decided we needed to break this cycle of awkwardness and distract ourselves with something completely different. "Andrew," I said one morning over breakfast, trying to sound casual, "how about we go to the farmer's market in the next town today? We could take a walk, buy some fresh produce. Maybe it will help us relax a bit." He looked at me slightly surprised, but then nodded. "Why not?" he said, his voice even, though I caught a glimmer of gratitude in his eyes. Perhaps he too felt that this was an attempt to ease the tension that had become almost unbearable. We drove to the nearby town on a narrow road lined with fields and woods. I turned on the radio and the music filled the car, trying to fill the silence between us. We exchanged a few words about the weather and how long it had been since we had been to the market, but any conversation felt forced and unnatural. The market was filled with the smell of fresh fruit, pastries and flowers. We wandered among the stalls. I tried to appear cheerful, but I could always feel his presence nearby, too close, too tangible. We bought apples, cheese and bread. Everything seemed ordinary, but beneath the surface I felt something strange and unknown rising. As we passed an antique shop, Andrew suddenly stopped and pointed to the window. "Evelyn, look," he said, his voice unexpectedly animated. I turned to see what he was pointing to. An old music box decorated with faded gold and ceramic inlays. For a moment, my breath stopped. I began, my voice shaking. It looks like my grandmother's, I finally said, unable to take my eyes off the box. It does. Andrew came closer, his fingers touching the glass of the window. You said it was very dear to you. I nodded, feeling goosebumps creep up my skin. Yes, it was her jewelry box. She kept old letters and photographs in it. Andrew was silent, but I could see he was watching me intently, as if trying to understand why this was so important. Do you want to go in? He asked quietly. I nodded and we entered the antique shop. It was dark and smelled of dust. The box sat on a shelf among many other forgotten objects. I picked it up and opened it carefully. Inside was an old dried rose and some yellowed letters. Andrew looked at the letters and something changed in his expression. Can I have a look? He asked cautiously. I handed him the letters and he began to leaf through them, his face growing serious. There's something here about our family, he said, sounding almost surprised at his discovery, about some arguments that happened before I was born. I felt a wave of anxiety rise in me. These letters, I didn't know they still existed, I said, suddenly wanting to take them back. But he continued to read, his face suddenly darkening. Why didn't you ever tell me about these events, Evelyn? His voice was restrained, but I could feel his anger. It's not something you talk about over dinner, I tried to joke, but I could hear the tremor in my voice. Andrew, some things are best left in the past. He nodded, but didn't look convinced. Perhaps, he replied quietly, but I'm beginning to realize that there's a lot more to our family than meets the eye. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The letters, the old music box, the tension between us, it all began to form a confusing and disturbing picture. I didn't know what to do next, but I could clearly feel that the situation was slipping out of my control. As we left the shop, I realized that our trip to the market hadn't alleviated the tension. It had only made it more tangible, more threatening. We returned from the market in silence, each lost in our own thoughts. The old letters and the mysterious music box had added uncertainty to our already tense state. I felt an invisible weight on my shoulders. Andrew also looked pensive, his eyes occasionally drifting to the window as if trying to find answers to some inner questions. To relieve some of the tension, I suggested we take a walk to the lake and have a picnic. The lake had always been my place of peace and solitude, where I felt safe. I hoped the walk would help us both find some balance. We walked along a winding path surrounded by tall trees until we reached the old wooden dock. Andrew immediately suggested that we go for a swim, as we used to do when he spent summers with us as a child. "Come on, the water's so warm," he shouted with a smile that suddenly seemed too bright, too desperate. I laughed as I watched him dive into the lake, breaking the smooth surface of the water into 1,000 tiny splashes. He seemed so young and full of life that I suddenly felt older and more vulnerable than ever. The water, the sun, his laughter. It all seemed unreal, like a scene from long ago, when everything was simpler and clearer. Andrew swam back to shore, his hair wet, drops of water running down his face, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. He came closer, laughing, and splashed water at me. I jumped in surprise and laughed back. At that moment, I felt him come even closer, so close that I could hear his heartbeat quicken. He looked at me with such determination, as if trying to reach deep into my thoughts. "You know, Evelyn," he began, his voice soft but sure, "you've always been more to me than just an aunt. I can't hide it anymore." I froze, not knowing what to say. There was something dangerous in his words, as if he had crossed a line I was trying to draw. Panic spread through me. "Andrew, you don't understand what you're saying," I said, trying to keep my composure. "No, I do," he replied firmly, taking another step towards me. "Maybe you're just afraid to admit it." And before I could say anything, he leaned in and kissed me. But this kiss was different. It was full of spontaneity and determination, and I felt something inside me tighten. His lips were warm, full of confusion and intensity, as if he was trying to express all his unresolved feelings in that one moment. At first I stood still, stunned, but then I felt a strange warmth rise within me. It seemed as if everything around us disappeared, and there was just the two of us on this old dock, surrounded by the mirrored surface of the lake. For a second I gave in to the feeling, but then I pulled away abruptly, as if waking from a strange dream. "No, Andrew," I said, feeling my voice shake. This shouldn't have happened. We have to stop." His face twisted in pain for a moment, but then he became serious again. "Why?" he asked quietly. "Why are you so afraid?" I didn't know how to answer, and a feeling of helplessness grew inside me. "Because it's wrong," I finally managed to say. "You're still young, you're just confused." He stepped back, his face growing even more serious. "Do you really think this is just confusion?" he said bitterly. "I feel like I've found something real here, something that can't just be ignored." "Andrew, we need to go home," I said, trying to change the subject, feeling that this conversation was leading us into dangerous territory. I turned and walked away from the lake, trying to hide the trembling in my hands. I heard him catch up with me, but I didn't look back. We walked in silence, and I felt something invisible settle between us, something more than words or actions. It was a shadow I couldn't ignore, a shadow that seemed to grow darker with each step, pushing us to the edge of something unknown and frightening. As we returned home, the evening light crept across the walls, painting them in warm shades of orange and pink. I felt exhausted, like after a long, heavy sleep that leaves a vague sense of dread. Andrew went to his room, and I stayed in the kitchen, mindlessly sorting through the produce we had bought at the market. I was still going through a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, fear, pain, and something else I couldn't identify. Suddenly, I heard a knock at the door. It was an unexpected, sharp knock, as if someone had come with urgent news or business. I jumped and went to open it, not knowing what to expect. Standing at the door was my mother, Ella. She looked worried, worry on her face. "Mum, what's happened?" I asked, feeling a growing sense of unease inside me. Ella me miró con dureza, como si estuviera estudiando cada línea de mi cara. "I need to talk to you," she said, entering the house as if she owned it instead of being a guest, and with Andrew too. I felt everything in me tighten. "Why with Andrew?" I asked carefully, closing the door behind her. "Because I know something is going on between you two," she said directly, her words hitting me like a punch in the gut. I immediately felt a wave of panic wash over me. "What do you mean?" I tried to feign ignorance, but my voice betrayed me, shaking. "Don't pretend, Evelyn," she replied sharply. "I've seen the way you look at each other, and you can't hide that expression on your face. Tell me the truth." I felt everything inside me turn upside down. Mum had always been sharp, too attentive to detail. "There's nothing between us, Mum," I said calmly, trying to keep my voice steady. "We're just confused. It's a difficult time for both of us." Ella me dio una mirada escéptica, su rostro permaneciendo serio. "Confused, Evelyn? You know it's more than that. I heard Andrew say something to you this morning. He doesn't hide his feelings." I felt fear rise in me. "What did he say to you?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. "He didn't say anything specific," she replied, "but I saw his face when he left. He's clearly in love with you, and it's wrong, Evelyn. You must stop this before it gets out of hand." Just then, Andrew appeared in the doorway of the kitchen. His face was serious but calm. "What are you talking about?" he asked, his eyes darting between me and Ella. "That something is happening here that isn't right," Ella said sharply, turning to him. "You have to understand that this can't go on." Andrew tensed, and I saw the same spark in his eyes that I had seen at the lake. "You don't understand," he said, his voice calm but tinged with irritation. "I know what I'm feeling, and this isn't some whim." "Andrew, stop!" I intervened, trying to take control of the situation. You shouldn't talk about it like that. It's more complicated than it looks. Ella turned to me abruptly. You're telling him to stop, but you can't do it yourself, can you? Well, I can't just leave it like this. I'll call your father, Andrew. Let him decide what to do. No, Mum, don't, I almost shouted, feeling my words hanging in the air, but it was too late. Andrew, standing in the doorway, froze. Are you serious? He asked quietly, but there was an undertone of fear in his voice. You're going to involve my father? Is that all you can do? Yes, I am, Ella replied firmly, because I can see you're getting involved, and I'm not going to let you both ruin your lives. Andrew looked at me, his eyes filled with disappointment. Did you know she was going to do this? He asked, and I felt everything inside me tighten. No, I didn't know, I murmured, feeling the pain rising inside me. Andrew turned to Ella. Fine, he said coldly. If you think involving my father will fix everything, then go ahead, but I'm leaving. I'm not going to stay here and listen to you decide what's right for me. He turned and walked quickly to the door without looking back. Ella, upset and angry, also made her way to the exit, giving me one last disappointed look. You should have been smarter, Evelyn, she threw over her shoulder before the door closed behind her. I was left alone in the quiet, empty house, feeling the cold walls closing in around me. I knew that something important had just snapped, like a thin thread that couldn't be reattached. And whatever happened next, I could no longer avoid the consequences.